Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. The NTIA has released some documents that will help states as they look how they're going to do their challenge process as part of the BEAD program. So they're fairly detailed, although they are just at this point preliminary, and they're looking for comments on that. I'll be right back and we'll look at those documents. Hey there, Rick Usley, Woodsey Quorum. Thanks for joining me. So as I mentioned, the NTIA has released a couple of different documents here. So in the description of this video, I've linked to this page where you can download both. And then I also link directly to these documents, the files where you can just pull them up right there. And as you see here, they're looking for comments and they want to get those in by May 5th, which would be a week from Friday, this coming Friday. So you only have about 9 or so days to do that. And if you click this comment now button, it basically is nothing fancy. It's just going to open up. I remember it opens a your email client, and you just type in your comment right there. So they're looking for comments on that. So I'm going to look at the documents. I want to go through specifically, the process one the most, and then there's also some examples that they give on how the states can answer some of the things that are required as far as the NOFO. So I'm going to look at those things. The first thing I want to look at was the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity for BEAD, because I thought it would be a good idea to kind of get a background and again on what the process overview is for everything that is going on in this, what the states are going to have to do, what the NTIA is going to do. So we're kind of past a couple of things here. So there was this letter of intent that states and territories needed to send that they were interested in participating in the BEAD program, and all of that's passed, and everybody, as you would expect, that could get this money said, yeah, we want it. There was a request for initial funds. Each state could get 10% of their minimum, 5%, excuse me, their minimum commitment. So every state could get 100 million, and they could get up to 5 million in planning funds, and then the territories would split that as well, as they would split between them the planning funds. Then you've got notice of available amounts. Now this is coming, is planned to be announced sometime June 30th or sooner, where the NTIA is going to come out and say how much each state gets, depending on the broadband maps as they are now. NTIA will make available to the eligible entity. Anytime you see eligible entity in here, it's talking about a state or a territory, or it could be talking about a tribal government, depending on what we're talking about. But that's what I'm going to just always say state if I can remember. So NTIA will make available to the state under the program notice of available amounts and invite submission of initial grant proposal, the initial proposal, and a final grant proposal, the final proposal. Then there's some technical assistance at that point that can be provided. Then there's the initial proposal. And what I'm noticing as to the guidance that they've provided today is that you can split up your initial proposal into 2 phases, volume 1, what they're calling the first phase, and then volume 2. Eligible entities will have up to 180 days from the receipt of notice of the available amounts to develop and submit an initial proposal. And I'm assuming states have already been kind of working on as much of this as they can. So they'll have 180 days. Once the NTIA comes out and says, okay, Mr. State, you will get X amount of dollars from the BEAD program based on your number of unserved locations relative to the unserved locations throughout the country. Then we've got the challenge process, and that's what a lot of this is about that we're talking about today, is the challenge process. After submission of its initial proposal and before allocating BEAD funds received for the deployment of broadband networks to subgrantees. Subgrantees would be internet service providers in the state, municipalities, co-ops, anybody that's going to be taking these funds and then providing broadband service. An eligible entity or state must conduct a challenge process. Under this process, a unit of local government, nonprofit organization, or broadband service provider can challenge a determination made by the eligible entity or the state in the initial proposal as to whether a particular location or community anchor institution within the jurisdiction of the state is eligible for the grant funds, including whether a particular location is unserved or underserved. And states must submit any successful challenges to NTIA for review and approval. So that's what this guidance is about, and there's several different steps in this challenge process, or several different things that need to be looked at in this challenge process. And then after that, there's the initial funding availability. The NTIA will review the initial proposals as expeditiously as possible. Once an initial proposal is approved, the NTIA will make available to the state not less than 20% of the total grant funds allocated to the eligible entity. So after the initial proposal they can get up to 20%, or not less than 20%, I should say. An eligible entity may initiate its competitive subgrantee selection at that point, once that's approved, upon approval of the initial proposal, and will have up to 1 year to conduct additional local coordination, complete the selection process, and submit a final proposal to the NTIA. So up to a year once the initial proposal is done. Now, obviously, they don't need to wait that long, but they have that long to do that. Then the final proposal. So we're not even at the final proposal at this point. After the eligible entity has selected subgrantees and otherwise executed its approved initial proposal, it would submit to NTIA a final proposal, again, up to a year later, describing how it complied with that initial proposal and the results of its process. The NTIA will award the remaining funds allocated to the eligible entity on approval. That would be the remaining 80% or any portion of the original 20% that was not originally there or used. So then they've got, after that would be ongoing monitoring, reporting, and performance management. So eligible entities, the states will be required to comply with reporting requirements and monitor subgrantee compliance. So the subgrantees or the ISPs need to do performance testing that is the same as what is being required, what was required under CAF 2, what's being required under RDOF, and then the same is going to be required for BEAD. And that's where they have to take up to 50 subscribers in an area, and they have to do once a quarter, they have to do testing for a week for speed testing and latency testing to a specific point that the FCC manages, and then that data has to be sent in, and so that's the testing that has to be done. And by the way, if you are a internet service provider that needs to do performance testing, then reach out to us. At the end of this, you can fast forward if you need to later or whatever, but at the end of this, you'll see our contact information. We can help with the performance testing where it's very inexpensive equipment, and just put it in. And I guess you don't have to do every subscriber, you just have to do 50. I think it's maybe for each speed tier that you're going to be doing, but you've got to do that testing, and that's got to then be reported. It's an ongoing thing, but we'll take care of all that for you and provide the reports that you need to send. So check us out for that if you need to do that performance testing. And then, let's see, there was a couple other things I was going to look at here. What page am I on? 13. I think it's a little bit further down. Yeah, here it is. So then you got program structure, sequencing, and requirements. So program sequencing, again, these are the different things that the states need to do: letter of intent, initial planning funds, 5-year plan, etc. But then I was looking down here, I thought I had something else to look at. Maybe not. We'll see if we got a color in here somewhere. If I highlighted anything. It's hard to find that little scroll. There we go. Okay. Initial proposal. Oh yeah, so we've got the initial proposal. So again, I think what we'll see as I look through this other document, this guidance document, it looks like it is split up so that I think what the NTIA is doing is saying, we want to be able to review some of these things pretty quickly. We don't want to have everything hit at once, and we want you to be able to get something to us so we can start reviewing that. But you can see here, they've got different things that they need to do as part of this. And these are the sections that we'll see when it's talking about the guidance. They're saying these are the things that are in this volume 1 initial proposal. There's number 3, which would be identifying existing efforts funded by the federal government. In other words, where are there already committed funds from other programs that would not be eligible? Identifying each unserved location and underserved location. That's important, and that's using the broadband data maps. Describe how the state will apply statutory definition of community anchor institutions, which is kind of controversial because for some reason they assume that anchor institutions would all somehow magically have their own broadband and wouldn't be subscribing to broadband from a standard service provider. And it could be, it's possible if you're a public, like a police station or somebody like that, and the city could be providing that and not necessarily be getting that from a standard retail broadband provider. But a lot of them, like libraries and others, are getting that broadband. So community anchor institutions are kind of a mess. They're going to have to figure that out. Include a detailed plan to conduct a challenge process as described in section 4B6. And that's, again, what most of this is about. But all of those things are required. So you have to determine what's unserved and underserved, and you have to determine what areas are not eligible because they are getting federal funds already. So that's all part of the challenge process as well. That's, I think, why these are included in this volume 1 section. We talked about that, and then it talked about that section on the challenge process. That's this here. So there's a section on challenge process in the NOFO as well. So anyway, so that's from the Notice of Funding Opportunities. So then, as I mentioned, we've got these two documents that you can get here, and I'm going to look at this first one, BEAD Challenge Process Policy Notice to provide eligible entities with additional guidance on how to design and conduct their BEAD challenge process. That's this document here. Again, you can see you can submit any comments to this address by midnight, May 5th, 2023. And it says, please note that these are draft documents. So don't rely on this, anything other than providing comments at this point until, obviously it's finalized. There's a summary information in here, and you've got your table of contents. And I'm going to look at some of these things. I'm not going to read every word in here, but I did want to highlight some things just to make it a little bit easier for you if you wanted to get a quick summary of this before you dig into it. And this would be interesting, obviously, to any state broadband office that is going to have to be doing this, but also I think anybody else that's going to be participating in the challenge process. If you're an internet service provider, or if you're a community that is going to be maybe making the challenges, I think you'd be interested in knowing what the process is going to be. So you see here the notice, the purpose is, talks about that. I don't need to read all of this. But it does mention here that the different areas that I was just showing in the NOFO. So this document outlines NTIA's additional guidance for requirement 3, 5, 6, 7, and 7 of the BEAD initial proposal as outlined in the NOFO. So we're just looking at those different sections. So again, identification of existing broadband funding, deduplication of the funding process, identification of eligible locations, community anchor institutions, the design and challenge process, so those things. And then these 4 requirements may be submitted prior to the complete initial proposal. So again, you can do these first 4 requirements first as part of what they're calling volume 1 of the initial proposal. Eligible entities must adhere to the requirements listed in this document to receive the Assistant Secretary's approval to conduct their challenge process. The policy notice includes 9 sections. Sequence of events, we kind of looked at that, I think. BEAD Volume 1 submission process, that's a timeline and a process. Existing broadband funding requirements, that would be identifying the existing locations that are already funded. Initial location data requirements, outlines requirements for using the National Broadband Map, which is going to be what determines what's unserved and underserved. Modifications to location classifications, the requirement to run a deduplication of funding process. BEAD challenge process design requirements, the requirements for the design and implementation of the challenge process. That's number 7 in that initial proposal that we just looked at in the NOFO. Post-challenge process updates, that would be section 8 of that. The section notes that eligible entities may, but are not required to update their post-challenge data to reflect updates to the National Broadband Map that occur after the conclusion of the challenge process. So there is the possibility that the states may update their post-challenge data, but they're not required to do that. Post-challenge process review, section 9, that's submission of the challenge process results to the NTIA for review. In the sequence of events, so here we've got, this is actually a sequence of events in this document. This is not the sequence of events that we were just going through in the NOFO. So you've got eligible entity develops the initial proposal, volume 1. Eligible entity submits the initial proposal, volume 1. That's optional. Eligible entity submits full initial proposal, volume 1 and 2. So they must submit their initial proposal, which includes volume 1 and 2. Let's see, eligible entities that have already submitted volume 1 above need to only submit volume 2 at this stage. So you don't have to split this up, but you might want to, because again, there's a lot. You want to get the NTIA working on as much of this as they can to get your funding as quickly as you can. So to split this up into 2 parts is probably a good idea. Then there's these blue sections are NTIA stuff that they do. So NTIA reviews and approves initial proposal, volume 1. Then the state runs approved modifications and deduplication of the funding process. And again, that's just showing that these blue things are NTIA. Then the state runs the approved challenge process, and there's a lot of information in here about that challenge process. The eligible entities submit the challenge results to NTIA, and the NTIA reviews those results and validates them. The NTIA communicates their determination to the state, and the state then publishes the final determinations. So that's that kind of the way that things are going to work. So BEAD Volume 1 submission process. Eligible entities must submit their BEAD challenge processes as part of Volume 1 of the initial proposal. Volume 1 will include the following initial proposal requirements as outlined in the BEAD NOFO, which we were just looking at. Okay, so this is kind of those steps. Identify the existing funded areas, identifying unserved and underserved via the broadband map. This is basically just repeating what we just looked at in the NOFO. Volume 2 will include all additional proposal requirements. Optional in the case of eligible entities that opt to request funding as part of their initial proposal. Such eligible entities will also be required to submit an initial proposal funding package, it mentions. NTI will review and approve Volume 1 first to allow states to begin conducting their challenge process. So that's the reason that you want to do this, is you can get Volume 1 to them, and they will hopefully look at that expeditiously, as they say, and approve it, so that then you can start the challenge process and not have to wait to get everything else to them. And that's, again, it says if you desire, you the state, prior to the full initial proposal. In no circumstances may an eligible entity begin its challenge process prior to submission of the full initial proposal, Volumes 1 and 2, and before receiving approval of Volume 1 from NTIA. And this confused me when I first read it, and I think I'm still confused reading it. So it says NTI will review and approve Volume 1 to allow eligible entities to begin conducting their challenge process. But then it says in no circumstances may an eligible entity begin its challenge process prior to submission of the full initial proposal, Volumes 1 and 2 to NTIA. Does that make sense to anybody out there? By the way, if you're watching, feel free to comment as if you're watching live into the YouTube chat. And if you're watching later, you can go ahead and put a comment on YouTube right there. But go ahead and chat if you want to right now. I'll pull it up if anybody has any idea how that makes sense. My understanding is that you do this based on this first sentence. NTI will review and approve Volume 1 first to allow eligible entities to begin conducting their challenge process if they desire, prior to the full initial proposal approval. So maybe what they're saying is you got to get both in. Maybe you've got to get both in. So I guess it will save the NTIA time. So if you get, that's my understanding. Now I'm looking at it, maybe I do understand this. So if you're going to have to do both your full initial proposal, Volume 1 and Volume 2, and get them both to the NTIA, but they will look at Volume 1 first and approve that so that you can then start your challenge process. But Volume 2 has to be in with them already. So I think that's what that must mean. So I'm just now understanding that live here with you. So again, and under no circumstance, that makes sense now, in no circumstance may an eligible entity begin its challenge process prior to submission of the full initial proposal, Volume 1 and 2 to NTIA, and before receiving approval of Volume 1 from NTIA. So you can begin your challenge process once you get approval from the NTIA that your Volume 1 looks good. But you can then you can begin your challenge process at that point before they approve Volume 2, if that makes sense. So I read this 3 times, and I'm finally now understanding it. Once submitted, the Assistant Secretary may modify the challenge process proposed. NTI strongly encourages eligible entities to regularly consult with their assigned FPO. That's your, I forget what that stands for, but that's your contact, basically, NTIA for your state person, on any question, and to submit their initial proposal, Volume 1, prior to submitting Volume 2. Existing broadband funding requirements. You must identify existing efforts funded by the federal government, as mentioned. You must initial location data requirements for eligible entities to use the National Broadband Map as a starting point. We kind of covered this. National Broadband Map use, community anchor institution identification. So we kind of talked about some of this. You can read through that on your own. Modifications to location classifications. As part of Volume 1 of the initial proposal, an eligible entity may, upon approval of the Assistant Secretary, modify the set of locations it proposes to make eligible for BEAD funding to reflect data not present in the National Broadband Map. So, states will have the opportunity to, they won't be able to change what they've been allocated, but they will have the opportunity to make changes to what is deemed eligible in the broadband map. And it mentions here modifications to reflect data not present in the national broadband map. States are required to provide sufficient justification that the modifications more accurately reflect the locations eligible for BEAD funding. Proposals may not A, add or remove locations from the set of broadband service locations the Commission has identified on the national broadband map, or change the definitions of unserved and underserved. So if a location's not on the map, I don't know what you do about that if you're a state and you see that there's a location that's not on the map. How do you not, you can't add or remove it. I guess maybe you can challenge it in some way. By way of example only, an eligible entity might propose the following: to treat locations that the national broadband map shows to have available qualifying broadband service, for example, a location that is served, delivered via DSL, as underserved to facilitate the phase out of legacy copper facilities and ensure the delivery of future-proof broadband service. And they're really, you want to put in fiber there when they say future-proof. So that's one example of what you might change. And then another example, to treat as underserved locations that the national broadband map shows to be served if the rigorous speed test methodologies demonstrate that the served locations actually receive service that is materially below 100 megabits per second downstream and 20 meg upstream. So even though it may show served on the national broadband map, if people on the ground say, hey, this isn't served and we have rigorous speed tests to prove this, then that is something that, again, it can be looked at modifying the data that's not in the broadband map that way. Deduplication of funding. A state may not treat as unserved or underserved any location that's already subject to an enforceable federal, state, or local commitment to deploy qualifying broadband as of the date that the challenge process is concluded. For locations with an enforceable commitment to deploy reliable broadband that's less than 100 by 20, the state must, subject to exceptions outlined below, classify these locations as unserved or underserved based on the speed commitment, the commitment requires. If the service provided in such a commitment meets the BEAD definition and requirements of reliable broadband, it will be considered an enforceable commitment regardless of the type of reliable broadband technology deployed. And I put a little note up here for myself to remember this, that when I was looking at this yesterday, unlicensed fixed wireless service does not meet the BEAD definition for reliable broadband service. So that may mean an unlicensed fixed wireless deployment funded by RDOF would not be considered an enforceable commitment and thus could be considered unserved or underserved. That's these are my own words, my own note. And that's what it says basically. Now it does say later on, it only mentions satellite as being something that would not be, that would make it unserved or underserved if it was satellite. But that's kind of a question mark there because there's two different things that I was reading as I was going through some of the documents. Deduplication process. Eligible entities must detail the process they will employ, including use of the BEAD eligible entity planning toolkit described in section 622 below, or alternative tools to remove locations that are subject to enforceable commitments. So there's a toolkit basically that they're going to provide. And then it mentions here on this toolkit, tools for identifying potential duplication of funding. NTIA will provide eligible entities with the option to use the BEAD eligible entity planning toolkit that, among other things, overlay multiple data sources to capture federal, state, and local enforceable commitments. So they'll make this toolkit available to maybe make that a little bit easier. Deduplication waivers. The BEAD NOFO also provides the Assistant Secretary with the ability to waive the requirement to exclude locations or areas with prior enforceable commitments at the request of the state in cases where the state can demonstrate that such a waiver is necessary to achieve the goals of the program. The state must request a waiver from NTI when it submits its proposed challenge process, or if the enforceable commitment was made after the proposed challenge process was submitted to the Assistant Secretary prior to the initiation of the state's subgrantee selection process. The Assistant Secretary will grant such waiver only for good cause shown, and that would be that it's necessary to achieve the goal of the program or the goals of the program. So that's mentioned twice there. So there is some leeway in identifying potential areas that look like they would be duplicated if, again, it's necessary to achieve the goals of the program. So maybe that again, talking about unlicensed wireless in an area, or maybe licensed wireless in an area, because one of the things I have a concern about would be that you've got licensed wireless from 5G operators, these, let's say, major national providers like T-Mobile or Verizon or AT&T, where there's limited spectrum and there's concerns about how long that spectrum will last and how many people in an area can use that spectrum. So if you have something in an area that's unserved and then a 5G provider comes in and they basically lock that area out of any funding, then what happens if they run out of spectrum? If they're successful in that area and they're able to sign up a lot of customers, but then they get so many customers that they can't then get any more. And one of the issues is that these are providers of mobile service as well, and mobile for them is their bread and butter, and they don't want to jeopardize that. So T-Mobile, for example, if you want to sign up for them for their 5G service, in some areas they won't take orders because they don't have enough spectrum. In other areas they'll take it, but they'll tell you, hey, time is limited, you need to get it now because we might not be able to take subscribers in the future. So those are concerns. So maybe that could apply to something like that. BEAD challenge process design requirements. Eligible entities must adhere to the requirements outlined below when designing their challenge processes. So this is what you need to adhere to. 7.1, description of challenge process. States must describe in detail how they propose to administer the challenge process within their jurisdiction, and that must include the following 4 phases: publication of the eligible locations, challenge, rebuttal, and final determination. And the publication, that's where they publish a set of locations eligible for BEAD funding. The challenge is a representative of one of the permissible challengers. That would be, again, a local government, a broadband provider, for example, community organization, I think might have been one of them. A rep of one of the permissible challengers submits a challenge to the eligible entity using an online portal maintained by the state or the eligible entity. These challenges must be visible to the service provider whose service availability is being contested. Each state must define a minimum level of evidence. So the states are going to have to create this online portal to accept these challenges, and that all needs to be visible to the provider, whoever that is, that made that challenge. Rebuttal, only the challenge service provider may rebut the classification of a location or area with evidence causing the location or locations to enter the disputed state. So only the challengee, is that right? Challenger? No, only the challenger can determine that. Final determination. Actually, I would be the challengee, sorry. Final determination. The eligible entity makes the final determination, the state makes the final determination, either declaring the challenge sustained or rejected. Allowable challenges. The following table outlines the classes of challenges that are allowable and unallowable. As you look through this table, you've got here allowable, and this is most of what is allowable is what you would expect. Locations, availability, speed, latency. Is it business service only? Data caps, technologies. What kind of technology is there? Is it really fiber? Is it not? Community anchor institution eligibility determination. So NTI will permit challenges to the classification of a anchor institution as eligible for BEAD funds if that institution does not receive at least 1 gig of broadband speed. So there is, I believe it looks like here that community anchor institutions, even though they weren't necessarily listed on the fabric as broadband serviceable, that there's this opportunity here to challenge that. Identifications, again, of community anchor institutions, enforceable commitments. These would be, they'll permit challenges to the identification of previous federal, state, or local enforceable commitments to minimize duplication of funding. Planned service. NTI will permit challenges where a broadband provider offers convincing evidence that they are currently building out broadband to challenge locations without government subsidy, or are building out broadband offering performance beyond the program requirements. So if a service provider wants to go ahead and pay for that, they can do that, and then the NTI can permit those challenges. And what's not allowable is classification of BSLs, those are your broadband serviceable locations on the fabric. For example, altering the BSL's building type, classification on the fabric to reflect a BSL subscription of mass market broadband service. So again, that to me again, it's a little confusing, but that to me is talking about community anchor institutions that may not be assigned or may not be determined to be getting mass market broadband service. But then again, there's this section here where you can challenge the eligibility determination. So, and then addition or removal of BSLs. It can't challenge to add or remove those BSLs, those broadband serviceable locations. 7.3, permissible challengers. Again, this would be units of local and tribal government, nonprofit organizations, and broadband service providers. And I'm assuming this nonprofit organizations would mean community groups, those kinds of folks. I would think maybe, well, munis would be here under local and tribal governments, but broadband service providers, I would think, would encompass any municipality or co-op that's planning on providing broadband service. So I think nonprofit organizations would mean like community organizations that are nonprofit. 7.4, evidence requirements. Eligible entities must ensure their challenge process is evidence-based, must outline a rigorous evidentiary review, may accept a wide range of data sources as long as documented and verifiable by a third party. The table below provides examples of acceptable evidence. If an eligible entity proposes to accept a data source other than those described in Table 3 below, that proposal is subject to NTIA's review and approval. So you'd want to try to stick with those that are in the table. And you can see here what we've got. We've got availability, speed, latency, data cap, technology, business service only, enforceable commitment, planned service. So you can look through all of this, just scroll through that. Location is not a community anchor institution. Location is a community anchor institution, so you can certainly look at that. Fairness requirements. The state must ensure that their challenge process is fair, that everyone has sufficient opportunity and time is given, and ensure that the challenge process standards of review are applied uniformly. Transparency requirements must ensure the challenge process is transparent publicly. They must publicly post a document explaining their challenge process, actively inform on that, publicly post. So not just post the documentation, but you've got to actively inform, for example, units, anybody that could challenge, local government, relevant nonprofit organizations, and broadband providers about the challenge process and the deadlines, and then publicly post all submitted challenges and rebuttals. Timing requirements must ensure the challenge process is expeditious. They must complete the entire challenge process within 90 days, allow a minimum challenge submission window of at least 14 days, allow rebuttals within a time period of at least 14 days, publicly post the final classifications of each unserved location, underserved location, or eligible community anchor institution, at least 60 days before allocating grant funds. Eligible entities may, however, now this was confusing as well, so you got to ensure that the challenge process is expeditious, and then it says you've got to complete the entire challenge process within 90 days, and it lists these requirements. The 90 days here, 14 days to challenge a submission, 14 days to allow rebuttals. So these seem like these are minimum requirements. Publicly post at least 60 days, and then it says eligible entities may, however, choose longer periods when determining the specific timeframes for the various components of the challenge process. For example, challenge submission, rebuttal window. I don't know, it says you got to do it in this amount of time, must ensure it's expeditious, and at a minimum, complete the entire challenge process with 90 days, blah, 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 blah. But then it says you can, each eligibility may conduct a final duplication. No, wait a minute, here it is. Eligibilities may, however, choose longer periods. I don't know, I don't get that. Maybe that's somebody can comment on that. I'm not going to comment, but somebody can comment on that if you find that confusing as well. And you're actually going to be doing this. Post-challenge process updates. Each eligible entity must conduct a final deduplication review process to remove from the list of eligible locations that are eligible for BEAD funding any locations that are subject to enforceable broadband deployment commitments. And then there's this note. So this is what I was talking about earlier up there. This post-challenge duplication process will remove, for example, locations that had their classification challenged to unserved or underserved from served due to the challenge process, but are subject to an enforceable broadband deployment commitment. We'll also remove unserved and underserved locations that became subject to a new binding broadband deployment commitment during the course of the challenge process. Actually, this is not what I was looking at earlier, but that's just, I thought that was interesting. So that it'll remove unserved and underserved locations that becomes subject to a new binding broadband deployment commitment during the course of the challenge process. Post-challenge process review. Upon completion of the challenge process and the final deduplication of funding process, each eligible entity must submit to NTIA for review and approval the proposed final classifications of each unserved location, underserved location, and eligible community anchor institution. And then there's an appendix in here. It's got the data format, so this is something you definitely want to look at. This appendix describes the format of the data files states must submit to NTIA to meet the requirements of the NOFO. List of unserved and underserved locations, community anchor institutions, that's in there. But then there's the all the formats in here for entity number, CMS number, FRN, that's your FCC registration number, location ID, so all of that. And I'm not going to go through the rest of that. Remember, that's basically the rest of the document, or all of that stuff. So, I had something here. Oh, here was the question mark. Relevant from the instructions from the BEAD NOFO. So they're pulling some data from the BEAD NOFO here. This is the question mark on what an enforceable commitment is that makes me question about unlicensed fixed wireless. An enforceable commitment for the deployment of qualifying broadband to a location exists when the enforcement to deploy qualifying broadband service to that location was made as a condition of, and then we see here, any high-cost universal service support provided under section blah, 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 except that in the case of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, RDOF, a location will be considered to have an enforceable commitment for qualifying broadband only after the FCC has announced in a public notice that RDOF support for that location is ready to authorize or is authorized, and B, the provider does not rely on satellite technologies to deliver service. So it doesn't mention unlicensed fixed wireless here. And there are certainly, I think there's certainly going to be some unlicensed fixed wireless RDOF awards that have already met Part A here. So the FCC has approved Nextlink and Resound Networks that are both wireless providers that were in the top 10 of the RDOF recipients. So they will most likely be doing unlicensed spectrum for RDOF because that's going to be less expensive for them. So they'll probably use something like CBRS to be able to, unlicensed spectrum to be able to get higher speeds that they require for RDOF. I suppose they could do some license, but that being the case, it's very possible that they could be considered a commitment here because it only mentions up here, where was it? Actually, it's down here. Whoops. Oh yeah, satellites. It's right down here. The provider does not rely on satellite technology. So that unlicensed RDOF could be considered, in that case, the way I'm reading this, that could be considered as a commitment, even though the BEAD NOFO says that unlicensed is not reliable broadband service. So there's some conflicting messages in here. So that would be another thing that I think should probably be cleared up, hopefully by commentary on this. The last thing I was going to look at, and I won't take very long on this, I just wanted to show you the other document. So this is the BEAD model challenge process. This is a shorter document. You can see here, this is the table of contents. And what this is providing is a way to answer some of these things. It would help you as a state to, as you put your initial proposal, volume 1 together, some of the things that you can do. As you see, the purpose, the NTIA BEAD model challenge process is intended to serve as an example of how a state may choose to meet all requirements from volume 1 of the initial proposal. How to use this, the document outlines the BEAD model challenge process, which eligible entities can choose to adopt in its entirety for requirement 7, and that's the challenge process of the initial proposal. In submitting volume 1 of the initial proposal, states must indicate whether or not they plan to adhere to the BEAD model challenge process. To do so, the eligible entity must copy and paste the model text into the appropriate response text box. Some questions will require additional information indicated in blue text throughout the document from states, even if adopting the model challenge process. So in other words, you can plagiarize. Okay, you don't need AI to do it. You don't need to write it yourself. You can plagiarize the stuff in this document. You just got to make sure that you fill in the blue stuff here. So they're giving you a template to be able to fill in a lot of the stuff that's going to be required that you're going to have to submit in this initial volume 1 proposal. And they give a couple of examples in here. I'm just going to show 2. One is very short and the link is not working yet. So for example, here you've got existing broadband funding You've got to submit a CSV file identifying sources of funding, a brief description of the broadband deployment and other broadband-related activities, the total funding, the funding amount expended, and the remaining funding amount available. States may copy directly from their 5-year action plans. And then it mentions here, states should use the example attachment to guide the format of that submitted. But if you click on this example attachment, it actually opens a Microsoft SharePoint and it wants you to log in. I tried that using my Microsoft account just to see if that would work, and it didn't. So I'm thinking that needs to be fixed. And I know I saw where somebody had already submitted that information to the NTIA to let them know or to find out what to do about that. So at this point, you can't see those attachments as far as I know. I'm assuming that at some point they will update this document and then maybe they'll work. Then you've got a few other things in here, again, where there's some attachments or things that don't, well, you got to insert your publication date here, but here's a couple of attachments that, again, they need to fix that. And then I wanted to show this one. So here's another example for community anchor institutions. This is requirement 6. And again, this is what the requirement states. Describe how the statutory definition of community anchor institution, for example, schools, libraries, health clinics, was applied, how eligible CIAs were identified, and how network connectivity needs were assessed, including the types of CAIs that the eligible entity intends to serve. And then here's your example response. It says the following response is an example that the state can use to indicate how it identified and assessed the needs of the eligible community anchor institutions. And again, you've got to fill in the blue text, but basically you can cut and paste all of this as your answer. You just have to make sure that you expound on the definition above according to its own interpretation of that. You can copy in all of this stuff. And then you've got, that looks like a link. Maybe that just stays in there. Then again, here's some information that the state needs to put in, or could. A state may choose to include additional types of categories of institutions as CIAs, must identify any sources of identification or types of categories of institutions it chooses to include as CAIs, community anchor institutions. And then here, eligible entity must include details on each source used to identify those anchor institutions. So again, you got your blue stuff that you need to insert. And, again, you're basically copying and pasting a lot of this stuff as it is. So again, these are example responses. And then there's an example attachment right here, which again is probably not going to work when you click it, at least depending on when you download this. Hopefully that'll be fixed later. So again, that's the rest of this document, is just other things that you're going to need to provide. So there you go. So again, I think this documentation should be helpful. Obviously, it's going to be helpful for the states that are going to have to be managing this challenge process, but I think also for if you're an internet service provider or a nonprofit that's going to be doing a challenge, or a municipality, whatever, if you're going to be doing the challenge, then you can look through this and see what the states are going to have to do in order to run through this challenge process. So hopefully that's helpful for you. Hopefully this video was helpful. Maybe gives you a summary of this so that you can look for these things specifically. You're going to have to read through the whole document, but hopefully this will give you a kind of a head start on figuring out what's in there. So if it was helpful, if you give me a like on the video, I'd appreciate it. If you're not subscribed, click the subscribe button, click the bell, and you'll be notified when I'm live. So I appreciate you joining me today for Broadband Deployment News, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.